Hello, folks. This is Gender in Focus, a podcast exploring how to create a more inclusive world for trans and non-binary people. I'm your host, Kai Scott, and I use the pronouns he and him. I'm the president of Trans Focus Consulting. Each week, I dive into real stories and expert advice, offering practical tips and actionable takeaways to help you lead with kindness, confidence, and heart. Tune in to discover how you can make a positive difference. It's just a conversation away. In this episode, we're thrilled to sit down with Adrienne Smith, a human rights lawyer and an activist dedicated to advancing equity for transgender people and others at the margins of society. Adrienne shares their journey, insights from their groundbreaking work, and the challenges and triumph of advocating for inclusion of gender diversity. Get ready for a deep dive into the intersection of law, gender, and social change with one of the most inspiring voices in the field. Let's get started. So, Adrienne, I'm really excited to talk to you about the law today, particularly human rights. And I'm so thankful you came on our show to talk about it. I'm a bit of a law nerd myself, so I'm really keen to jump into things. But I think a good place for us to start is just to get a sense of what inspired you to pursue a career in law, and how has your transgender identity shaped your approach to human rights? A small question to begin with.
Yeah, just that. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you for your very gracious introduction. It is a very nerdy thing to be interested in, and I appreciate your interest in the law. How did I get here is your question, I think. I did not plan this. I was going to be a physicist when I was little, and then realized I can't do math. But the activism came out of the trade union movement. I was elected as a steward for the union workplace that I worked in, and I did that diligently for many years until I got to a point where there was a ceiling and a barrier to making better change, and I couldn't do more. And I had kind of stars in my eyes. I'd moved to Victoria to work as a researcher at the Legislative Assembly, which is amazing to work in a monument. Victoria was not the town for me. I was very unhappy and quite lonely. And then I came back to Vancouver and did something entirely different, and started working frontline for the Portland Hotel Society, which is the organization that operates Insight. And it was not legal. It was not anything legislative. It had nothing to do with that world. And I feel like it's still some of the most meaningful work that I've ever done. Changing bed sheets in a shelter and handing out rigs. But I had written the LSAT, which is the admission exam for law school, sort of because I'm bored and I'm the kind of nerd who would write the LSAT for fun.
Wow, that's amazing.
When I was living in Victoria, and I had sort of applied, I guess, and forgotten about it. And then I got an email at the very end of August that summer. They said, you got into law school. And I thought, oh God, I will quit my job and find some way to pay for this. And then I went to law school for 3 years. It's a 3-year program. And then you do a year of sort of an apprenticeship in law. It's called articles. And I was very fortunate to article at a union firm when I did workers' compensation law,
Right.
which is really important, occupational health and safety. It felt meaningful. It's also a system that really needs an overhaul and a way to streamline it, make it much more accessible and clearer to really everybody involved in the system what to expect, because people think I've been hurt, I'm going to be able to make my rent, and that's really not true. And it was really heartbreaking work. And I went from the end of my articles, sort of picking up these stitches that I guess I had left, and I went to Pivot Legal Society where I did drug policy and fought against mandatory minimum sentences. And what we argued was that for women, for Indigenous folks, and for people who come before the court as a result of their addiction, this one size fits all, really throw the book at people kind of sentencing didn't work. And to take that individual advocacy, the trade union aspect of it, the social justice for folks who are experiencing a criminal barrier to accessing healthcare, felt like collecting all of these loose threads together I think the human rights stuff, you describe me as a human rights lawyer, and this is still a bit of a surprise to me because that wasn't my plan. I wanted to
Mm,
do criminal law.
mm,
I got a master's in constitutional law,
mm.
but I find myself doing human rights, and I think it's meaningful change and important. But I think I would be doing this flavor of work no matter where I was.
Right, right. Because there's such a need, no matter what the topic is, and or the lived experience, the way that you describe it, and so beautiful too how you're able to bring all of that together. No matter if we're talking about Indigenous rights or people using drugs or trans and non-binary folks, like there's just so many different needs that it's really important to have that expertise that you have to be able to leverage it in for our collective good, and hopefully to get to a more humane, inclusive, and considerate society. So I'm so glad you're doing this work, and really thankful. I can appreciate that there's a lot to it, and it can feel overwhelming, like you were saying at times. So it's, yeah, really wonderful. I'm curious what kind of, if there are kind of unique challenges or opportunities that you might have encountered as a transgender lawyer in the legal profession, given the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think for people who want a short answer about what I do, I say I do underdog law, and
Hmm.
I'm not usually aware of my own status as an underdog unless I'm in law.
Mm,
And it is an extremely traditional profession with some very rigid gender roles and expectations about how you will behave.
mm.
We had a workshop for law students, and they tell you like the career services office is very hardworking and diligent, and they're of tremendous assistance.
Mm.
This particular workshop was unhelpful when they told us what to wear to a interview. And
Oh no.
men, of course, you're going to wear a blazer and pants, and it's going to be gray or black because it's law. And women, you're going to wear the blazer and the pencil skirt and a color block blouse that's not too low cut. And then there's a picture to show us
Oh
how
wow.
low cut is. It was a drawing, and it was not a curvy body like I had, and it wasn't representative of the kind of um, career that I wanted. Certainly, I think law schools really direct people towards a corporate, in-house, big firm.
Hmm.
I wanted a different path, and I wore pants to my interview.
Yeah.
But equally, there's some trans femme folks who would be much more comfortable in the pencil skirt, but can't do that. And
Mm,
I feel like the legal profession is really a step back in time. When I worked more clearly in human resources, it wasn't like that. And I think
mm.
there's something about the credential that really puts us back, you know, carousing with Charles II, which is the reason lawyers wear black because we're
Oh
still
really?
in mourning about the death of King Charles because he would come and party with us. He's the
What?
same guy. He's the reason you don't button the bottom button in your vest because he
Oh.
enjoyed himself and became curvier and couldn't do his bottom buttons up, so it became the
Mm,
fashion.
mm, mm.
So like it's super weird pomp circumstance. But
Yeah.
with that are expectations that people will hold the door for me, and
Mm,
judges call me Ms. Smith, which I mean
mm.
I don't expect them to know who I am, but we also have a
Right.
time at the beginning of the hearing when we're invited to give our pronouns, and
Mm.
that's actually really useful because I can tell when other people don't do it where how it's going to go.
Right. Oof. Yeah, true. It's like a litmus test almost. Yeah.
I've had some actually quite disastrous
Mm,
times being trans because, as you know, as I'm sure your listeners know,
mm.
there's really a concerted anti-trans campaign going on,
Yeah.
and some of that manifests in the profession, both in the courtroom but also outside. We had a
Mm,
there's a Canadian Bar Association, which is the closest lawyers get to a union,
mm,
and at its annual general meeting, there was a debate about pronouns, which was really a cover to discuss the legitimacy of trans people.
mm.
At last year's Law Society AGM, there was a discussion about it was just really, in my respectful view, it was residential school denialism and
Whoa.
an effort to force the Law Society to change content of its Indigenous competency training, but
Right.
the discussion was really quite aggressive, and I think in the general equity universe,
Mm,
the legal profession has a long way to go. It's a little bit farther behind, and I don't. That doesn't make me sad because I
mm.
can look elsewhere and see how much positive change has been made in so many other sectors.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And that, people such as yourself and others present in the, sector really help to make this tangible, because I think many people lose track when they're kind of debating broadly, and they don't realize that there's human lives behind these kind of what to them probably are a bit theoretical, and so yeah, I think that's, yeah, super important, but of course also very exhausting to be present for those types of discussions, and to weigh in to counterbalance with what some of the dialogue and direction that people want to head in. um, so I just want to shift gears a bit, and talk more broadly about trans rights or transhuman rights. But here in Canada, in particular, certainly there have been a lot of changes, and you were mentioning some of the positive shifts, particularly around protected grounds that have been changed both on a provincial as well as a federal level. And so I just wanted to, get your insights on kind of some of those changes to human rights protections for trans people, trans and non-binary folks across Canada, and what have been those changes that have happened.
Sure. I think it's important to say that trans people have inherent dignity and always have. And like all laws, our human rights legislation is an imperfect effort to capture those and to write them down. I mean,
Mm,
just because it's not in the code doesn't mean you're not worthy. There was a time when the Alberta government didn't put sexual orientation in its human rights code on
right.
purpose, but that doesn't mean that you know queer Albertans weren't entitled to protection. And ultimately, what the court did was called reading in, and they just decided, well, you didn't write it there, and you
Mm,
meant not to write it there, but it has to be there. The
mm.
case is called VRIEND, VRIEND, for the one nerd out there who's going to go to Canley, which is a fantastic resource, CANLII.org. It's a coalition of law librarians. For
Mm,
my nerds out there, like, law librarians are the most nerdy superheroes in the world. They run this
mm.
free website where all the cases are. Um, so we have this inherent dignity that really predates how those rights are captured in the law. And trans people have always been protected in the provinces, the territories, and federally because discrimination on the basis of sex has always been illegal.
Mm,
And some of the really early human rights cases talk about particularly trans women on the basis of sex.
mm.
The governments decided that explicit recognition and putting gender identity or expression in the wording of the law was important, not because it created a new right, but because they wanted people to be able to recognize themselves in the law. This is the same as what happened more recently when indigeneity has been added as a ground.
Mm, mhm.
Indigenous folks have always been protected on the basis of race and ethnicity, and in some settings, religion. But to have it explicit means people see themselves in the law and they say, "Oh yeah, okay, that could be me."
Right.
Um, I think what's really important is to think about trans recognition under human rights law in cases in a long scheme, and not to think, Alberta issued this problematic decision last week,
Mm.
um, which is about a woman who phoned 911 because her friend was missing, and she
Oh,
was
right.
treated quite badly by the dispatcher, who told her that her friend shouldn't be in that profession, assuming that they were both
Mm,
sex workers, and misgendered the caller. And I mean, when these cases come out like that, it's quite disappointing. You're like, oh, is this a step back when
mm.
governments are overtly anti-trans? But over the scheme of several decades, it's actually quite comforting. There's this foundational case that came out in 1999 about a woman who went to a bar in Victoria, one gay bar in Victoria. The
Mm,
case is called Sheridan and Sanctuary Investment, and she went there and they treated her quite badly. They asked her for her
mm.
ID. She didn't look like her picture. They hassled her using the bathroom. She filed this human rights complaint that took 2 years to be heard. And that
Ah,
case, which is still the law, Still good law says there's a business reason to ask for her ID. In that case, to police the liquor law, make sure she's old enough to go there.
Right.
But you don't have to look like your picture, which is good because a hellscape when we all look like our driver's licenses would be monstrous. Uh,
True.
but it says really clearly she can use the ladies' room. She's a trans woman.
Mm,
She can use the ladies' room. We know non-binary people are entitled to a barrier-free bathroom that doesn't misgender them.
mm,
Like, and what I mean explicitly by that is the picture of the superhero with the cape
mm,
and the superhero with just the tights. There needs to be just a picture of a toilet,
mm,
so that you know people will know the facilities inside rather than expectations about the
mm,
bodies of people who use it. But I mean, it's really comforting to me that since 1999, the law has been that you can use the damn toilet, and this rule applies equally to sports teams and uniforms and fitting rooms, and
right.
um, that's never been displaced. It's been reinforced by some subsequent cases, and um, I mean, 1999 is a long time ago in
Mm,
the memory, certainly of most workers
mhm,
and most folks who consume a service in the city. And I think about Ms. Sheridan and the tremendous uh, sacrifice she took, talking
mm,
about the discrimination she experienced so that we would have the benefit of this law. But it's also really heartening that that's still the law. And I think for folks listening to this who are, you need to go think about your office and think about the layout of the toilets and whether that's
yeah.
actually accessible, and maybe do that extra step for disability justice and not put the bathroom behind a door that needs to be locked, because anybody who's, disabled or has a small person knows you
Mm,
don't have time to go ask for the key. The bathroom should just be open. And if there's a problem with how people are behaving in the bathroom, we have different rules for
mhm,
that, but locking a service, it's like a padlock on a water tap. You wouldn't do that,
mm,
and so we shouldn't be locking up our toilets.
mm.
Hmm.
So true. Such a good analogy to kind of really drive it home that, you can provide a space, but then depending on how it's set up, you can bar access to it in the
Yeah.
name of safety. But there's also people being able to access that space.
This is not a new problem, and I think about the way that we have administered social programs like hot lunches in
Mm,
schools. Super important for kids who might not be getting a meal at home, but
yeah.
when we do it badly, we make them all line up at the poor kids till or have a card or something, and everybody can see
Mm,
you're getting a free lunch, and it doesn't need to be
mm,
like that. And um, I don't think that's a controversial discussion. I don't think that gets into some of the culture war around trans people, but it's an example of how to deliver access to things people need in a compassionate and respectful way.
mhm. And thoughtful to have thought it through from the perspective, the lived experience perspective of like this wouldn't feel great, right? Doesn't take
Mm-mm.
too much of a stretch to understand that. And certainly washrooms has been a big issue, like you were mentioning. Certainly not the only one. I know the media tends to focus on it quite a bit, and it is an important issue. But certainly having these landmark cases really clarify it, especially in contrast to some of the things that are happening south of the border now. I think this is integral, and I think many people, especially employers, are often surprised by
Mm-hmm.
this case law. And it's not just, I mean, Sheridan being a really important kind of get the ball rolling, but then half a dozen or more court cases that have reinforced that. Why do you think that is? That there's just like a lack of understanding that this case law is in place, and to provide people with that type of access to washrooms.
Well, in the ideal world of nerds, we all, of course, sit down and read the decisions that come out of all levels of courts and tribunals on top of our exploding inboxes.
Mm,
I think a lack of access to the law has been a problem. I think
mm,
this website, Canly, is a great leap forward because you used to have to go to a law library or dig through paper records. So
mhm,
just access to the law has improved, but it's not a thing that lots of people do read cases.
mm,
And when they do read them, it's a 300-page case, and you're not sure
right.
which part is important. I think the human rights tribunals are very good at being very clear. And I think having a lack of activists in this area who can explain what the law means practically in language that people understand. Like, I can use the bathroom. That's the law, it says here. Like,
Yeah.
people need plain language explanation of what's actually going on. But I think trans people are a special category because for so long we weren't allowed to talk about the fact that we existed. And
Mm.
as
Hmm.
you know, the coming out pattern was to discover that you're trans, to access what healthcare you could, to, in the model we were supposed to follow, live in your real life trial and then have cross hormone treatment and
Right.
get surgery if you could afford it. And if you passed, you move to a different city and burn your yearbook and never tell anyone
Hmm.
you're trans. It's a different world now when our rights aren't contingent on our having been medicalized in that way, but
Mm.
also I can use my fancy pronouns out in the world and it's actually possible to live like that. And I think lots of people think that they've never met a trans person. They have. We're everywhere.
Absolutely.
There's a trans person
Yeah.
possibly in your living room at this moment. You have already
Mm.
shared a bathroom with a trans person. Um, but I think access to safety and to services on the basis of gender has really been restricted to a discussion about women's rights. And
Right.
women's rights are fundamentally important. Trans rights are allied with women's rights.
Hmm.
But when we also add and she to all of our policy documents, we haven't actually dealt with the problem that gender puts limits on who all of us can be, and that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. And so important that we'd be advancing these important issues together in tandem and in coordination, and showing where there's overlap and need on so many different sides of gendered experience. So
I think it's really useful for practitioners who are in the workplace who aren't sure
mm,
if what the trans person is telling you about a thing that they're experiencing is problematic.
mm,
It's not a perfect parallel, but substitute another equity denied group and
yeah.
say, if this person had dropped the N word in this conversation, we would respond immediately. If this
Hmm.
person had said, oh, all you women are sex predators, we
Hmm.
would stop that kind of talk in the workplace. And um, we allow much more overt anti trans discrimination
Mm,
just because it's newly on people's radars. And that intellectual exercise can help to really highlight when something's just egregious and inappropriate and disrupting the respectful workplace that we should have. Nobody needs to
absolutely.
be a legal expert. We have widgets to make and we want the workplace to function. And your basic respect policy covers all of this already anyway. Nothing fancy needs to happen.
Absolutely. It's not a huge mystery that people can figure it out in some pretty easy ways. This is a great exercise to figure that out pretty quickly, too, right? It's not like it's a huge investigation to figure out what to do. It's like it's right there, already accessible. Uh, wanted to kind of expand past the washroom court cases, and I know recently there have been a lot of additional court cases that have come forward. Some that I think are really good to just get a little bit further into, particularly around pronouns, privacy, some hiring practices. I don't know if
Mhm.
you wanted to kind of give a broad overview of what some of those cases have been. Obviously, there's a lot of detail to it, but just something useful for folks to understand and appreciate about those.
Perhaps I'll start with the punchline about legal recognition for trans people, and it's one sentence. It's very easy. People can write it on a post-it note on their workstation. Trans people are entitled to immediate recognition
Mm,
of all aspects of gender.
yeah.
That's not difficult, and the cases have coalesced around bathrooms and gendered spaces,
Mm,
but also really notably language. And beyond that, there's the criminal law that prevents us from the basic things trans people unfortunately experience all the time, like criminal harassment and assault and threats. These are really common if you have public facing services.
right.
Anybody who's going to see the public increasingly is going to experience discrimination on all grounds.
Mm,
Particularly race is another area that is increasing catastrophically. So your
yeah.
frontline service staff are going to be experiencing these things um, no matter who they are. But
Mm,
trans people particularly will experience a particular kind of discrimination on the front line. But the easiest thing we can do is change the way that language happens in our workplace because trans people's pronouns and our chosen names are legal requirements.
mm,
These are not optional.
mm,
There's a legal requirement, not just to not use the wrong language for me and really reduce my dignity in the workplace, but
mm,
the Human Rights Tribunal says there's a positive obligation
mm,
to use people's names and to use our pronouns. I think for folks who aren't trans, the case that establishes this is called Nelson, and
mm,
it has a really important section about the importance of names. I had the infinite honor of representing Jesse Nelson at the BC Human Rights Tribunal, and
mm,
they told the tribunal about their name.
mm,
In their workplace, they're a restaurant server, and folks who've been restaurant servers know you're often not entitled to the dignity of a name. Your name is
mm,
Sweetheart or Honey, or Jesse
ugh,
had pink hair, so they were called Pinky. And
mm,
one of the things that they told the tribunal, they kept telling this coworker, use my name.
yeah.
My name is Jesse Nelson. And I think that section means not only that trans people have a legal right to have our names recognized, even if they're not legally changed, which is important because the
Mm,
BC government has just restricted name changes. But I think for folks who aren't trans, who have adopted an anglicized name just because it's easier for other people,
yeah.
I think those folks have a legal right to use their actual name and to have it pronounced correctly.
Mm,
And perhaps I'll send you the link from the signature block in my email
mm,
for the show notes, which is a little button you can add to your signature block
mm,
that says beside your name, pronounce or hear it. And you go to this link and you record how your name is said so that
yeah.
people can do it. And I mean, if your name is Adrienne or Drew or
Mm,
David or Jennifer, it's important to still do that,
mm,
just sort of to normalize the use of the tool.
right. Yeah. And such a simple, be able to address the situation, allow people to play it, hear it, reinforce it, and actually use the proper name. It's,
Hmm.
yeah, such a simple thing, but really profound in how it translates. And thank you so much for mentioning too that even if somebody can pronounce say for example, my name's pretty easy to pronounce, but even so, there's value in adding it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if your pronouns equally are obvious to you and to everyone around you, the act of putting them in your signature block is still important because it shows trans people who get mail from you that you might be safer than
Mm,
people who don't do that. And it costs nothing. Your corporate style people will allow it. It's fine. But I think you asked me to talk a little bit about the cases, and I want
mhm,
to talk about a couple of important ones that happen in British Columbia, but are the law across the country. We've been met by other human rights tribunals that have come up with similar rules. And the first case is I mean, I talked about Sheridan, which is very important about bathroom access. The
right.
language cases are called Dawson and Nelson. And Dawson is about a trans woman who was arrested by the police. It's a BC human rights case about non-discriminatory access to services because being
Mm,
arrested is a service.
mm,
And what happened to this woman is that she was referred to by the name on her driver's license, which is not the
mm,
name she uses. And the police didn't reliably call her she, her when they know that she's a woman.
mm,
They also denied her some critically necessary medical care when she was in the jail. So we're not sure how much of the $15,000 injury to dignity award she got was for the healthcare and how
mm,
much was for the language. But this case establishes that misgendering people, which is to use a suite of language that implies a gender for a person,
mm,
and it's incorrect, and dead naming, which is to insist on using a name that the person hasn't chosen to use. These are human rights violations, and they can be quite expensive.
mm,
Those are service cases, but the Nelson case that I mentioned before, it's called Nelson and Goodberry Restaurant. It's about a restaurant server.
mm,
That person was fired for being misgendered,
mm,
and they got a $30,000 injury to dignity award. They were experiencing some problems with a I would say transphobic coworker who wouldn't use their name,
yeah.
wouldn't use their pronouns. He told the Human Rights Tribunal that his father had fought in the war so that he wouldn't have to tell lies. And
Mm,
the worker did what they were supposed to do and asked the manager for help. And the
mhm,
manager said, sure, but later.
mm,
And later never came. There was a dispute between these two workers. The employer preferred the bar manager and called my client a few hours before their next shift and on speakerphone in front of some witnesses who were good enough to come to the tribunal and
mm,
testify. But what the manager said was, you asked for too much too soon and you came on too strong
mm,
in terms of language. And
mhm,
Jesse Nelson got $30,000 as an injury to dignity award, not because they were misgendered in the workplace, but
mm,
because they were fired for insisting that the workplace use respectful language. And this
yeah.
is a really significant decision. It was met that same summer by a case coming out of Ontario called EN and Gallagher's Lounge.
Mhm.
And this case is about three non binary workers in a restaurant kitchen. And the manager um, told a customer that he had three T word, transphobic slur,
Mm.
working in the kitchen. He used this offensive word, but he also exposed these people as trans
Yeah.
and outed them. And dead naming, misgendering, and outing are the three big ways
Mm.
that, I mean, I don't want to say they're polite or garden variety. They're not overtly violent in a civil in a physical way, but they're
Right.
the most common problems that trans people face in the workplace, and they're human rights violations. There's a similar case called BLAC and MC Tractor that extends this to federally regulated workers,
Mm.
which means that every worker in Canada has a right to use their name, use their pronouns, to have their trans status protected at
Mm.
work. I think this is tremendously important, and it's not the world that I started doing law in. There were not cases that said this then, and I can't help but be hopeful.
Yeah. It so clearly spells it out, and in some of the ways that the judges talk about it, it's so crystal clear in a refreshing sort of way, because oftentimes people try to kind of figure out how to maneuver around these very basic considerations and obligations, like you said, which I find baffling. But it's like timely intervention of managers and leaders, you know, respect is owed to everyone, including trans and non-binary folks, which includes first name, pronouns, right? Just like so clear, and puts that obligation on the employer too, which I don't think sometimes people don't know.
Well, and that's not hard. We have this obligation to everybody all the time. I think a lack of education about trans people helps it to fester. What I'm most proud of about that decision isn't that there was a case, because I don't, frankly, I don't want human rights hearings. I don't want to put people through having to tell their story.
Sure.
Um, I don't want folks to be embarrassed by the decision existing forever. But I got an email one afternoon, Friday afternoon, when I was feeling kind of sad,
Yeah.
from a fast food worker in Smithers
Mm.
who said, I gave my boss Jesse Nelson's case and it's better now.
Oh.
And that's what we want. We want it to be better. We want
Yeah.
spontaneous action of normal managers doing their job to make respectful workplaces so that we can focus on doing the work, whatever that work is to happen. We don't want big cases. I don't want
Mm.
more clients. I don't want to go to the Supreme Court of Canada again and tell them trans people experience discrimination. It was lovely what happened at the Supreme Court of Canada in a case called Hansman and Neufeld.
Mm.
The Supreme Court had never mentioned trans people.
Mm.
There were no mentions in any of the law.
Really?
And this case was about a school trustee who had said some really quite offensive things. The president of the teachers union was asked for comment,
Hmm.
and he said these remarks are hateful.
Hmm.
The trustee sued him in defamation, and the case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Wow.
At the Supreme Court of Canada, what they did was notice all of this human rights law that we've been talking about in all these cases and adopted them into Section 15, which is the equality provision of the Charter. And they
Wow.
said, trans people are protected. This isn't pretend, it's not optional.
Mm.
And despite that, we still experience tremendous discrimination and there's still work to be done, which
Mm.
solves the problem that I was afraid of
Mm.
when the human rights codes changed, that people would think, oh, well, it's in the code now, so it's sorted. The
Right.
application to the real world is still very important. And to
Yeah.
have that recognized by the highest court in Canada, really significant win for us.
Wow. Oh, that's so exciting and relieving too, because, to kind of leave things out there for interpretation or, for some other way for people to deke around it. It's like super exciting to hear that. And also so thankful for you to be there to explain it, especially, as a trans person that has a very powerful impact. I know there was someone else who did that, the U.S. Supreme Court Chase recently, and I think that even though it didn't go the way we needed it to go, but certainly having him there really landed in a very powerful way. So I think that's tremendous, even though we still have a long way to go. So um, one thing I wanted to, there's some questions that we get quite often. People can be anxious, especially cisgender or people who are not
Yeah.
transgender, can be anxious on this topic, and often they misunderstand the law. In particular, we get if I accidentally misgender, which is different than intentional misgendering,
Hmm.
will I be sued for discrimination or will I go to jail? That's just where people's heads are at. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and if you that there are other common myths about the
Hmm.
law when it comes to trans people.
It's a really common misunderstanding that I think has really been exploited by this anti-trans movement
Mm-hmm.
to think that somehow people will be punished and will go to jail. The criminal law is really special. It has a really high bar, and it goes like in its own box.
Mm,
If you're accused of something in the criminal code, the criminal law deals with that, and a very small subset of those lead to jail.
mm,
And I have lots of views about the criminal law. I don't practice there anymore because it's heartbreaking.
mm,
But the kinds of things that would get people sent to jail for mistreating a bad person are very serious
mm,
stalking and assault and sex assault and very elaborate, clear to prove hate actions.
mm,
Um, Even the hate speech provisions in the criminal code are very seldom prosecuted. So people aren't going to go to jail. Let's just put that to the side.
mm,
Unless they attack a trans person. And I think we have views as a society that a criminal sanction is appropriate for physical violence.
mm, mm,
Human rights law is it's quasi-constitutional, which means it has a higher status than all the other laws in the country.
mm,
Um, if you violate a human rights code provision, then there's a decision. Usually the penalty is financial, like Jesse Nelson.
right.
But the Nelson case is really helpful. When Jesse first got hired as a server at this restaurant in a small community, what they said was, I'm a non-binary person. I'm transgender. I
Mm,
use they, them pronouns. Is that going to be a problem?
mm,
And the manager, who had never met a trans person before, I think,
mm,
said, we've never had that before. I
mm.
don't know. We'll try. And that was enough for Jesse. The bar is not perfection.
Yeah.
And as people were learning how to put they, them pronouns into a sentence, they made normal errors like they were learning.
Mm,
This was okay with Jesse. It's not that you're going to, like a judge is going to accidentally call me Ms. Smith trying to be respectful, that they're going to get the book thrown at them.
right.
Um, it, there is a sort of trans people can tell the difference between an honest accident and a malicious refusal. I saw this
Mm,
like
mm,
maybe offensive Instagram. The person said that they were explaining misgendering, which is using the wrong language, to their mom.
mm,
And they said it's like farting in public. Like, if you do it by accident, people will notice and they'll forgive you. If you do it all the time because you don't care, they'll come to think that you're rude. If you intentionally fart at somebody, they're going to think that you're an a-hole.
yeah.
And I think that's a really good way to think about it because people are very concerned. And I like human resources folks out there who are trying so hard.
Mm,
Thank you for trying so hard. Um, the world is not going to collapse if we mispronounce Wei Jing's name or if you
mm,
accidentally put the F box on the extended health benefit enrollment because there's only two
mm,
boxes.
mhm,
Um, I think it's really important to ask people what they want,
mhm,
not to put them on the spot and make them do extra work of teaching you how to do it, but also really enforcing our existing respectful workplace policies that say we don't get to pick on people. You don't get to
mm,
just make up a name for someone. You ask people what their names are and what they want to go by in the workplace, and then you do that. And when they complain to you that somebody's being disrespectful, even if that disrespect is unintentional, you have an
mm,
obligation to do something. And human rights law is really clear that the intent isn't the point, it's the
mm.
impact. We don't show malice,
Right.
which means an unintentional process or a policy that is uniform to everybody and not meant to be discriminatory
Mm,
could be.
yeah.
Nobody is set out to tell me I can't use the toilet because there's only men and women's bathrooms in the workplace. Like, that's
Right.
not anybody's nefarious intent, but it makes it difficult for me to use the toilet, and that means I won't work for you.
Mm, mhm,
And so, in terms of talent acquisition and retention, it's easier just to put toilet on the wall, um, but also to make sure that whatever it is that people need to be respected no matter who they are, is enforced stringently.
Hmm.
And I was at an event, a social event last night, and the person asked me how it was going for me because
Yeah.
she's like one of those mama bears who wants everybody to be included. And I said,
Mhm.
nothing creepy has ever happened to me here. And
Hmm.
she said, oh, it was like a bar where there's alcohol served. And she said, that's really important for me in my event. It's really good to hear. If it ever did
Hmm.
come to me, it would stop immediately. But I
Yeah.
think the tone of these things is really set by what the organizer is willing to allow. And
Mhm.
that's true also in the workplace. If management is willing to let garden variety disrespect happen,
Mhm.
it will escalate into something worse and targeted. But enforcing basic respect isn't just a nice thing,
Mhm.
it's a law. But it also helps everybody. And I think the best example of that is the needlessly controversial SOGI 123 learning resource that is in place in public schools in British Columbia. They did a study, and it doesn't just reduce discrimination for
Mm.
queer and trans kids. It makes every kid in the school system feel more included in a measurable way.
Mhm.
And everybody has a respectful workplace policy already. Everybody has an anti-discrimination process.
Hmm.
And I think the secret is not to think of a better process to handle complaints, which is the tempting legal nerd way to go and think,
Right.
well, let's talk about my process for complaints. Let's foster an environment that is
Hmm.
very difficult to be disrespectful in.
Right.
Incidentally, it also boosts profit and productivity and retention and all those other things that you're looking for.
Mhm.
But it makes it a pleasant place for people to come to work.
Yeah.
And it's
So,
easy and it's like practically free and already a core part of lots of people's jobs. You don't need a DEI HR dedicated office to handle
mhm.
complaints. You need a well applied respectful workplace policy and a way for comments about how it's not doing its best
Hmm.
to be handled in a way that isn't a formal complaint.
Yeah. 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 It's so true, and that's a way to kind of help continue to shape the culture if it's slightly or very off, and not including everyone, not respecting everyone. I agree so much. There's like this can most of everything that we're talking about can be solved on a cultural level, and yeah, sure, there's some effort involved in shaping a culture and intentionality, and not letting things slide when maybe you're like, oh, maybe nobody heard that, or you try to kind of make do, but intervening in those moments that seem small can help towards preventing the larger things from happening. Such a good point.
I had the most transformative meeting. I was invited to a law firm to talk to their senior partners.
Hmm.
And I got there expecting to do the social justice talk.
Yeah.
And I got there, and they're corporate and tax lawyers.
Hmm.
And they don't do this kind of soft people and culture work.
Hmm.
Um, but they came to the workshop because they wanted to learn how respectful pronouns affected their work doing corporate tax and doing commercial law. And I think making sure everybody gets the benefit of our basic training is another useful thing because we tend to focus on uh, like a certain category of management or
Hmm.
frontline reception staff
Hmm.
when really everybody needs to hear it. And I see this so often in organizations when the category of people who do a thing are trained, but their admin staff aren't,
Right.
which means the person who actually answers the telephone might call me ma'am
Hmm.
in a way that's just like a barrier for me to get to where I need to be. And I want to lift my hands up to Van City, who has a compulsory 5 minute training video for all staff that everybody has to check off that they've watched
Okay.
every year.
Hmm.
And they were very fun to film. It's like sometimes tellers are like, you're the pronoun one. um, but
That's
I did
awesome.
this cute little series of just internal training videos
Hmm.
that are short and people can
Hmm.
watch them without having to dedicate a whole afternoon to a DEI seminar.
Yeah.
And then you can say like, hey, you've had this training video, what's still happening, what
Hmm.
kind of support do you need to not call that person with this language. And it gets us into the problem solving before the problem has happened.
Right.
like taking your vitamins and eating a vegetable and going for a walk rather than just hospital as my solution for all healthcare.
It's so true. And I love the accessibility of something short
Mhm.
because you're right. Not everybody has time and availability, certainly frontline staff, especially. They're stick handling so much that, having short moments of micro learning and with some reinforcement or reiteration certainly can bring people along. This is not rocket science. Some people may think it is, but it's actually not once you kind of think about it and whatnot. But I have one more question just to kind of close us out here. I know we've covered a lot of terrain here today. There's so much exciting stuff happening. I'm curious if you could if you could create one legal change to improve the lives of trans folks, what would it be and why? I know it's unfair for me to say one, and you're okay to go beyond one, but just curious what the kind of big thing would be to help folks out.
You've asked me how to fix the world. Um,
Absolutely. World peace.
because I'm a lawyer, I think a lot of my focus is on how the legal system is failing us.
Mm,
I'm writing a book about vexatious discrimination claims
mm,
and people who complain that they're facing serious discrimination and they're not. They've
mm,
just heard something offensive. Um, and it's an irony to talk about reducing discrimination claims from somebody who does discrimination claims as my job.
mm,
I think I've got lots of views about the legal system and what an early screening process and the ability to dismiss claims that don't have merit
mm,
would look like, not just in court, but also in grievance arbitration and under discrimination policies for
mm,
any workplace. But that's not what you asked me. You asked me what would make the world better. And I think it's for people who are not trans
mm,
to think about what they can do to make wherever they are in the community feel safer for trans people, but also for folks who are as white as me
mm,
to think about what the implications are of not ever being uncomfortable in learning. Like we might accidentally put the word potluck in the middle of Ramadan, which is a
mm.
fasting month for Muslim people, because we don't know.
Right.
And you don't know what you don't know.
Mm,
Somebody said, "Oh, I'm gonna have to learn for my whole life," and that feels so hard. But I
mm,
think that's actually quite joyful, is to think about
mm.
what it is that you don't know and to talk to people who don't look like you,
Yeah.
who don't live in your community, who aren't in your sector, and find out what they're doing about the same struggles that you have. Because it could be
Mm,
that there's a very easy solution
right.
that has the wheel has been invented somewhere else, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. But also, you can't think about like I talk to men in the industrial jobs who don't really appreciate what it's like to be a woman working in an industrial job there.
Mm, mm-hmm,
And it's like, oh, yeah, but you work with this woman here. Just listen to her. And they're like, oh, yeah, she has been saying all along that this, that, and the other thing.
mm,
Like, yeah. So I think maybe listen more closely to the people around you. And
mm.
what I'm telling everybody now is to spend half as much time online as you do with actual people, because there's an algorithm that focus you into
Mm,
seeing more things that are profitable for them.
yeah.
You're not allowed to actually get actual accurate news, like it's banned.
Mm,
Facebook doesn't let you read the news.
yeah.
um, and it there's this temptation that your echo chamber will persuade you that the whole world is like it is wherever you are, and that's not true, and it keeps us from learning about each other, and it allows I think these pockets of frankly hate to fester.
Mm.
So go outside, talk to somebody,
Yeah.
have a conversation with your neighbor about how they're doing. Um, Go do community. And I mean, if you're microdosing a movie, scrolling through Instagram like I am every night, maybe don't do that.
Mm,
Maybe call your friend, have a nice quick chat before bed instead of
mm.
needing to look at all of those things.
Absolutely. So truer words have not been said. I think it's so important, as you said, to kind of the social media is not really, I mean, it serves us in some respects. There's a positive aspect to it, but certainly I think net negative to where, especially kind of reaching beyond our comfort zone to be able to get to know others who are so close by, right? Like,
Mhm.
arm's length away, really. And I've been doing that quite a bit and this is closer to, it's within our community, but Two-Spirit folks, right? I mean, that's something where I'm really wanting to deepen my understanding. Certainly I understand reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, and needing to advance things to address the harms, the tragedies of the past and the present. They continue. So I think that's a really important call to action. That, yeah, it may feel uncomfortable, and I don't know exactly what to do at every moment, but I'm there. We can all be there for each other and listen, like you said. So,
And the point in a space like that is to listen and to let those folks drive
mm,
the change. I think
yeah,
I've been invited to the equity employer run equity group in a number of workplaces,
mm,
where people who share a set of identities are told by their boss to go participate in making the workplace better. And I don't know that that's actually the solution. I'm
mm,
glad those folks are in the room. I don't think they should have to do the heavy lifting.
mm.
And I think for people as incandescently white as I am, it's really important to hear from folks who are not,
Right.
who can tell us what needs to happen,
Mm,
but not also expect them to do that on top of all the other things they're doing.
yeah.
So if you have a trans inclusion policy and there's no trans people, look at that. But also, it's not a problem you can just hand to those folks and say, go fix this workplace. Like, we're going to fix it centrally,
Yeah.
but you're going to tell us what changes need to happen, and we're actually going to listen.
Yeah. And help out by doing the effort, because it does take some
Mm-hmm.
effort to make these changes, and that's so critical, because trans and non-binary folks, or racialized folks, Indigenous folks, already handling so much. So if you can take things off the plate rather than putting things on, it makes a huge
Yeah.
difference.
And inclusion is not optional, it's a
Mm,
legal obligation. So
mm,
it's not like I don't want to do that. It sounds like a lot of work. It
yeah,
does sound like a lot of work, but it's how are we going to do that this piece this time?
yeah, yeah. One step at a time, too. Yeah, and like you said, it's actually a gift. This is like an opportunity that, whether it's somebody who is already in your midst or somebody you can anticipate being in your midst, um, that's a huge thing. And there's so much that can
Mhm.
be learned about those, a set of people, about oneself in relationship with those people. At, anyways,
Yeah. And
there's
someone's thinking, we have no non binary employees. Well, go fix your toilets and then you might.
right. So true. Well, anyways, thank you so much, Adrienne, for this wonderful episode. I've really enjoyed our talk today. I'm, of course, just incredibly thankful for your work, your passion, your dedication, for who you are as a person. I mean, this is, I always hype people who are working in the field, in so many fields, in so many regards. So, where can people find you if they want to follow up after this episode?
Oh, I have some pluggables to plug. If
Okay.
people want to talk to me about legal work from me by me,
Hmm.
my website is adriennesmithlaw.com, ADRIENNESMITHLAW. But also, I want to talk about the Trans Legal Clinic in British Columbia. We got a big grant from Van City
Mm,
to pay for name and gender change ID updates.
amazing.
So people want a free name change, they want help with a gender change. We will help you for free and cover all the costs, and a lawyer can stick handle that process for you. You write to us at lawyer@cwhwc.com.
Hmm.
For folks who need to join us by phone, it's 604-442-4352. We will meet at your convenience by Zoom anywhere in the province. If you're outside of BC,
Hmm.
but you have BC documents, we can help you. We can also connect you with whoever is doing the kind of trans law in your province that you need. We do free name and gender changes. We do full representation on some big files, like the Nelson case was a
Hmm.
clinic file.
Right.
But we'll also give people half an hour of free legal advice about whatever issue they're having if they're two-spirit, trans, and non-binary. And that makes us a little different than
Hmm.
clinics that specialize by area of law. It's terrifying and big, but it's what people need. So if you know a trans person, you need some legal help, please reach us. If you want to talk to me, adriennesmithlaw.com. Thanks so
Excellent.
much.
Amazing. I'm so excited. We'll put all of that in the show notes as well, because I'm sure that'll make it easy to access. And again, thank you so much. And I hope you have a good rest of the day. And we'll sign off from here.
Thanks so much for having me. Have a fantastic day.
Bye for now.